But first, well, this summer I have had a road to Damascus style conversion. Yes, folks, I am now a firm believer in climate change. And just like so many worthy individuals before me, it was the Australian summer that finally convinced me. You see, for the majority of my summer holiday this year, I experienced firsthand the ravages of global warming. Indeed, my entire summer holiday was a victim of catastrophic climate change. It was so damn cold, so wet, and so miserable every single day that I spent most of my summer with the heater on, rugged up in Ugg boots and tracky dacks, staring at the wet drizzle outside, wondering when it was ever going to stop. Talk about a catastrophic summer. And this morning in Sydney, it was no better. Rain, drizzle, cold. And then I remembered all those politicians and commentators and celebrities who used last summer's Australian heatwave, drought and bushfires to grab the headlines, to proclaim their conviction that the summer was the final proof of catastrophic climate change. Remember, Josh Frydenberg proclaimed that climate change was creating hotter and drier summers. Our view, he speaks in the plural, our view of climate change is that it's real. Like the Queen. We accept the science, the Treasurer said. So too, other federal ministers like David Littleproud and indeed the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, all clambered aboard the smoky, scorched bushfire bandwagon to insist that climate change was responsible for the summer fires. They were then in turn joined by all those desperately earnest New South Wales ministers like Andrew Constance, proclaiming the bushfires had a raft of reasons behind them, but the predominant one was climate change. And his colleague, Matt Keane, blathering that no one can deny that climate change is to blame for the smoke haze choking Sydney as bushfires burnt across New South Wales. This is not normal, Matt declared. Then, of course, the international mob all piled on, from Greta to Prince Charles to the UN to Piers Morgan on some chat show, and every other climate lovey screeching to the whole world that climate change was to blame for Australia's bushfires.
Where will this leave Australia, and certainly with their outlook on global warming? Are you getting the sense now that this is a big shift for the whole sort of collective of the nation and their conscience?
We even had a royal commission that announced that climate change, yes, is responsible for our hot weather and bushfires. So naturally, as we all shivered through this summer, certainly the coldest I have ever experienced in Australia, going right back to the 1960s, I scoured the press daily, waiting for Josh or Matt or David or Piers or Charlie Boy or Greta or the UN to come out and again grab the headlines with the exciting and very good news that climate change and global warming is also capable of preventing bushfires by creating extraordinarily cold summers with so much rain that even the most dedicated arsonist or pyromaniac couldn't light a match. Alas, all those earnest climate converts seem to have disappeared under the doona themselves. So let me proclaim it. I'm a climate change convert now. The new and improved climate change, now with added extra cold and wet weather to douse those flames. It was so cold and miserable that even the ABC had to admit that Alice Springs had the coldest Christmas day on record. Must have been one of the holiday fill-in journos who let that one slip through. But then, just this weekend, an extraordinary article in the Sydney Morning Herald by the ABC's Richard Glover made me sit up and take notice. Richard, funnily enough, was one of my closest friends in high school, and he's always been a very talented writer. But that's not what grabbed my attention. What hooked me in was his opening line. "Summers were hotter when I was growing up," wrote Richard. Indeed they were, and Richard beautifully evoked in his piece those searing hot summers of the 1970s. Any skin not left at the beach would end up adhering to the bench seats of the family Kingswood. Air conditioning was a rarity, he recalls. No one slept a wink from about November to March. You'd just lie there in a puddle of sweat. The whole of Queensland was a 6-month-long wet T-shirt competition. If the 1970s had a signature smell, it was the smell of antiperspirant deodorant and automobile air freshener, writes Richard. Great stuff. But the trouble is, Richard is a firm believer in global warming. So he had to reconcile his own lived experience of a hotter Australia in the past with his belief that we're heading towards some kind of climate apocalypse. The summers weren't actually hotter, he asserted in a disappointing second sentence, but they felt that way. Okay, feelings, right. It's hot only if you feel, okay. And he went on to claim, without citing any evidence, that half a century on and the world is much hotter, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Okay. Actually, Richard, Australia's worst heat wave was in 1939, as Craig Kelly pointed out on this show last night. And according to this graph, there has been no net warming in the last 22 years. And according to this graph, the planet actually cooled by half a degree in the last 12 months, despite increased CO2 levels. Those graphs are based on NOAA readings. And as I shall explain when Ice Age Watch returns this coming Sunday on Outsiders, everywhere from Siberia to Texas to Turkey to Spain has suffered one of the coldest northern hemisphere winters on record. So much so that COVID restrictions in Leeds last weekend were interrupted by a giant snowball fight. And herein lies the problem. There is only one theory that all climate change alarmism is built on, the theory of the greenhouse effect. Namely, that increased man-made CO2 levels are cooking the planet as if we are in a giant greenhouse. But unfortunately, none of the predictions made over the last 30, 40 years based on this theory, theories like all snow will disappear by 2020, clearly not, or rising sea levels will flood our cities, clearly not, have ever come true. And the real lived experience of people does not match the greenhouse theory. Bizarrely, way back in the 1970s, when the period Richard wrote so beautifully about, environmentalists and eco-scientists were convinced the world was actually heading towards an ice age. Global cooling, they called it. Then, a decade later, in the 1980s, another great decade, a new theory emerged, known as the greenhouse effect. That theory then morphed into the global warming scare of the 1990s. And then it magically turned into the much more ambiguous and generic climate change of the early 2000s. And that in turn changed into catastrophic climate change about a decade ago. We even spent millions of dollars in Australia changing all our good old-fashioned bushfire warning signs to include the super scary new catastrophic category, because apparently extreme wasn't scary enough. Obviously, there's more extreme than extreme. Next, global warming became, global heating, because warming clearly wasn't scary enough either. And now we have the dreaded climate emergency. But what happens when, no matter how aggressively you rejig the language or how many signs you repaint, good old Mother Earth simply refuses to follow the alarmist script? This week, we've had two hilarious examples of the lovies busily at work. In a theory worthy of Monty Python, NASA are now claiming that the Australian bushfires actually cooled the planet. That's right. You see, follow me, follow the dots. Climate change caused the bushfires. The bushfires released all the smoke into the atmosphere. The smoke goes around the planet, reflects the sun rays off, and cools down the planet. Ipso facto, climate change causes global cooling. You can't make this stuff. Or maybe you can, because it gets even better. Wait for it. Now, scientists at Cardiff University are claiming that thanks to global warming, the icebergs, melting icebergs on the planet, are all doing some weird kind of geological jig and rearranging themselves around the oceans. I think I've got this bit right. which is sending us, wait for it, into the next ice age. Let me quote from the study. Melting icebergs are the key to a series of chain reactions that plunges Earth into a prolonged period of cold temperatures. They go on in the study. As the Southern Ocean gets saltier and the North Atlantic gets fresher, large-scale ocean circulation patterns begin to dramatically change. Wait for it, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and reducing the so-called greenhouse effect. Is this a spoof? Apparently not. Global cooling is the new global warming. Woohoo! We've gone all the way back to where we started. Maybe my Ice Age Watch segment on Outsiders every Sunday morning will soon become compulsory viewing for all the school kiddies. But at the end of the day, just remember, if the models and the predictions and your lived experience don't match the theory, there are only two possibilities. Either the evidence of your own eyes, your own feelings, your own experience is wrong, as Richard and others believe, or the theory itself is wrong. Take your pick.